Is this SRAM GXP crankset the worst crankset in the world? I don't know. Honestly, I think it's pretty decent, and I think if you set it up correctly, it works pretty well. But I don't know. Let's take a second look, dig a little deeper into this thing. All right, so it's kind of this is my GXP SRAM Force crank. Like I say, it's got a Quark power meter on it. This is a 2012 SRAM Red power meter. Initially, this thing came with some BB30 cranks that I had, and eventually I made the switch. Actually, I went from a 30mm crank system to the GXP system, just because I found it to be much more easy to maintain, lower maintenance, and much less issues with creaking. But anyway, I think these cranks, originally it was manufactured by Truvative before they were bought out by SRAM. I think they were the ones that actually came up with this design. It was basically a kind of a response to the Shimano's Holotech 2, which came out 2004 or so. So this crank actually has been around since probably 2005, 2006, something like that, or the GXP interface, I guess you could say. So anyway, standard, like Shimano, it's 24mm essentially spindle, or at least the portion where the spindle there where the bearing fits on, 24mm OD, and that's actually a Shimano bearing. So you know, that basically just fits right onto the bearing bore there. And then on the this portion, it steps down to 22mm. So we got our 22mm bearing there, and then typically you'll have some type of a dust cap. This is one that typically you'll see with I think this comes with a BB90. I've seen this on other applications, but sometimes they'll have an orange dust seal with a little, you can tell because it has little splines that fit into the crank spindle splines. But so anyway, some of the differences between, like, let's just compare it to a Shimano. Shimano's crank arm, you know, it's got some splines on it, but theirs, basically you just preload it on. You know, the crank can basically float to kind of offset differences in the bottom bracket shell widths. You know, it doesn't matter what kind of bottom bracket shell it is, there's always slight variances between the actual width of the bottom bracket shell. So Shimano, it's easy for them to compensate for that. You know, you get your bearings in there for whatever way, and then you just tighten the arm on to where it just both arms rest up against the outside edges of both bearings. You know, you get it too tight and it's going to side load the bearings and they won't spin very smooth. If it's too loose, the crank arm will float back and forth within the bearing. So it's easy to get Shimano's dialed. You just use your preload to get them in the sweet spot, tighten the two pinch bolts on either side, and you're good to go. So I think the challenge with this one, just to not infringe on any of Shimano's patents, was to come up with some, you know, a different way. Honestly, I kind of like this way in that this bearing will never get side loaded because it rests up against the edge of the shoulder there, and then the other end rests up against, you know, of course you'll have your dust cap in between, but it rests up against this flat portion of the crank arm here. So at that point, you're going to have some kind of space normally between the outside edge of your bearing here and then the edge of the crank arm or the spider face. So that's kind of where these little wavy washers come in. My thoughts on the wavy washer are just, yeah, you just want to ditch this thing. So yeah, just take that out of the package and throw it as far as you can. And what I like to do, we'll get into this, kind of the fit up, is just fill that void if need be with smaller shims till you get the right spacing. I don't know, requires a little bit of experimentation, but that actually, in my opinion, works better. So back to this, there was a video out, you know, claiming these are the sloppiest, worst manufactured, worst engineered cranks ever to be since the, I don't know, since whenever. Worst crank ever in the world. So, let's go ahead and just, I'm going to go ahead and attach this. This is all stock parts. Even though this crank does have quite a few miles on it, it's not worn out that I can tell, but so I've got it just started. You can see some play on there, as the other guy claimed. That's about where his was when he got it tight. But honestly, I've never, in all my years of working on these, and I've worked on thousands, have I ever seen a setup where this, you couldn't get that tight enough to get all the play out of there. So this is, you know, this thing calls for quite a bit of torque, about 50 Newton meters or so, but that's not even that tight. If you get any tighter, you're not really doing much. It's not going to get any really tighter than this, but I don't know if you can see that bearing. It's moving there nice and freely. There's no, I can't move it radially, laterally. I can't rock it back and forth. So, you know, I don't know what the problem was there. So, anyway, yeah, let's go ahead and install this thing on the bike. All right. So in the case of this particular bottom bracket, we've got, this is a BB Infinite bottom bracket, which is, it's basically a press fit 86 bottom bracket. And initially this bike had, this bike was just gifted to me from a race team I was on. It came with a Shimano bottom bracket interface, so it's got a Shimano bearing on this side, and what I did, just kind of rigged it up and knocked the bearing, took the bearing out on this side and pressed in the GXP bearing with the 22 millimeter inside, and then this is our little dust cap there that's going to go on the outside. So anyway, what we want to do first is get a just a definitive measurement, so from this end to that end with the dust cap included. Alright, so if I take my little cheap calipers here, what I want to do is just get that on there as squarely as possible. That's a pretty tight fit there. And coming up with a measurement of, I don't know if you can see that, but 93.98. So roughly 94 millimeters with the dust cap. That seems fairly tight there. So okay, so what we're going to do now is measure basically from this plane here to where the bearing is going to rest, or whatever spacers we may need to fill that gap. There's basically this silver part, you got the 3 bolts that hang it on, but I feel like this black portion here where the actual spider is sticks out maybe the furthest. So let's see here. Yeah, I'm coming right up with 94.02. So, yeah, that's that's less than a tenth of a millimeter from here to the end, which is essentially how I had it set up. I had tried to put some really thin shims along the bottom end here, and what'll happen is if there's too much space in here, you're going to get into some side loading on the bearings, because this side's going to be fixed. If that bearing's pressed in all the way, the edge of your crank arm and spider combination are going to be pushing on this bearing. So this bearing's going to get side loaded. If there's too much space in here, you'll have a gap between the edge of the spider and the bearing, which you don't want that either, because then just from pulsing and pedaling and whatnot, it's going to want to push in, and it's going to put too much load on this bearing. So you got the little wavy washer. My advice on this thing, or my opinion, is just to ditch this thing altogether, because if that thing is really, I mean, especially on, you know, how it kind of just goes back to like the whole press fit 30 BB30 thing, where people run these, and even if you have this thing almost all the way compressed, you can still push on the side of that crank by hand, move that spindle back and forth, which causes creaking and noise, which 90% of the time, that's the main issue with those things. But that's another story for another time. What I like to do is just, there's been times where I have needed to add spacers on these. And so what I would do is, you can get, Wheels Manufacturing has these little Delrim spacers that are, you can get them as narrow as 0.5 millimeter, and those work pretty well. It's kind of something you got to experiment. I mean, you can see this one kind of insets in. You know, a lot of times if that's not inset, I can take a pick or something and basically mock the crank up in the frame, tighten it up, and if I can move that little spacer, then I'll just add them until it either feels like it's starting to side load, or those are, ideally you want it to where everything's together, spins nice and free, and you can't really move the little spacers in here. But obviously this one, like I say, you're not going to be able to get in there, so it's just a little bit more trial and error, which I've done before. Came to the conclusion that just running this straight against the crank arm has worked the best for this particular application, with that bottom bracket and everything else. So yeah, let's just put it back in the bike and see what it does. Alright, so we got our dust cap. I will say these bearings that are currently in this frame are pretty bagged out as far as just worn out. They've seen a lot of rain, a lot of rainy races, things like that. And as far as the torque spec on here on the spindle bolt, it actually calls for 48 to 54 Newton meters, so that's going to be pretty dang tight. But you know, there's a little bit of bearing noise just from, I can hear the seals kind of dragging, but this thing's never creaked on me once, and you know, I don't know. I've never had an issue with this particular one. I've installed thousands of these on different bikes, and you know, it's one thing to look at it from an engineer's perspective and measure things and find things wrong before you actually experiment with it and kind of try to figure it out just by working on it, rather than, I don't know, that's kind of, I guess, my take on it. Is I've been having to work on things for 30 some odd years that were poorly engineered, but finding ways to make it work, whether it be modifying or just kind of thinking outside the box. But anyway, my point is, I think this is a decent crankset frame interface. The reason I actually went to the GXP in the first place was I had an old, I've had numerous Cannondales with press fit 30s, BB30s, and got sick of constantly chasing the creaks. You know, there's ways to get rid of them, but then they typically there's always some kind of issue just with that bearing system. So went with the Wheels Manufacturing press fit 30 to GXP, and that was a crankset I put in, and a year and a half later, I never even, you know, I had it for a year and a half, 2 years, and then I finally just sold the bike, and it was still flawless when I sold it. So anyway, just throwing this out there. I think GXP is a decent, maybe not the greatest, but it's definitely a decent not a super expensive alternative. So yeah, that's just my little opinion on the matter, and hopefully you found the video insightful, helpful. If you're not already a subscriber to my channel, please consider subscribing, and thanks for watching. See you guys next time.